I'm sorry I can't join you this morning in Bishkek, but I'm glad I can share some thoughts on education innovation for the 21st century through this video with you. Everywhere skills have become the key to 21st century societies. They change lives and they drive economies. We've recently collected some data on this through our survey of adult skills. And what we could see is that individuals in the adult population who have strong literacy skills were more than twice as likely to be in employment. They were over 4 times as likely to earn a good wage. And it doesn't stop with money. We found a strong relationship between skills and the health of people, their propensity to volunteer. People at the high end of the skills distribution see themselves as actors in our societies. People at the low end have a fairly low sense of political efficacy. They do not believe they can change things. Even trust is very closely related to the skills that people have. But at the same time, we also know that more education alone doesn't automatically translate into better skills, better jobs, and better lives. In many countries, we see this toxic mix of young people coming out of university, not being able to find jobs, but at the very same time, employers say they cannot find the people with the skills they need. That brings me to my presentation. We need to do better in understanding what are those knowledge and skills that drive economic and social outcomes. And one thing is clear, the knowledge economy no longer pays you just for what you know. Google knows everything. The knowledge economy pays you for what you can do with what you know. We have some really interesting data on this for the United States that shows the evolution of labor utilization. We can see that there has been a decrease in the demand for manual skills over recent decades, and that's easy to understand. Those skills have become automated. Machines do those things better than people. But the steepest decline has actually occurred in what we call routine cognitive things. Just teaching people to do something and expecting them that will help them later in life is no longer sufficient, because those are precisely the kinds of things that are easy to digitize, automate, and outsource. In turn, we have seen an increase in the demand for non-routine analytic skills. And this is not about, reproducing what you know, what you've learned, but about extrapolating from that and using your knowledge in a novel context. And we have seen important increases in the demand for social skills. That's the light green line in this chart. To summarize this, the skills that matter today are about ways of thinking. Creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, decision making, learning. They have to do with ways of working, communication, collaboration. And they have to do with tools for working, information technology, literacy, those kinds of social cultural tools that enable us to have a window to the world. And all of this, of course, is about living in this world today, in an increasingly complex, volatile world. It's to do with fairness, integrity, courage, self-awareness, respect, empathy, with resilience, with adaptability, curiosity, initiative, leadership. Those are the kind of non-cognitive, social-emotional characteristics that matter a lot too for success in life today. Well, once we know what those skills are, we need to figure out what is the right mix of skills and how can we develop them in effective, equitable, and efficient ways over the life cycle of individuals. Our international PISA comparison are one way to look at the skills that individuals have obtained. Here you see results from the last PISA assessment in the year 2012. On the vertical axis, you see countries ordered by their student performance, the capacity of 15-year-old students to creatively use information, be mathematically literate, be scientifically literate. And on the horizontal axis, there's also an important dimension. That's the capacity of education systems to mobilize all of their talents. On the left side, you see countries where the impact of social background on educational success is strong. And on the right side, you see countries that have a socially more equitable distribution of learning opportunities. What's interesting are the countries in the green quadrant here, many of them from East Asia, that enable all students, students from all social backgrounds, to do well, to acquire the kind of skills that are important for success. We've looked at this also in the adult population. Problem solving in a digital environment is today very important. On the panel here, you see, for a selection of countries, the share of workers, adults in the age of 16 to 65-year-olds, who have basic or more advanced problem-solving skills in a technology-rich environment. And you can see in Sweden and Finland or the Netherlands, adults are better equipped. In Poland or Ireland, adults are not so well equipped. But even in Sweden and Finland, you see that's just about 40% of workers who are actually prepared for what we call the flat world today, this kind of technology-rich environment in which people live and thrive. Now I know what you're going to tell me. This is all to do with older people not keeping up with technology. But even if you look at the young population, the bars are longer, but not that much longer. We still talk about only half of young people today who are reasonably equipped for this flat technology-rich world. In some countries, there are big differences. For example, if you look at Korea, you can see the total population doesn't do very well, but the young population is quite a bit ahead. But if you move just one country upwards to the United States, you can see basically young people coming out of school and university are not much better equipped than those people who are leaving for retirement today. So there's a lot to do in many countries to equip more people with better skills to collaborate, compete, and connect in a technology-rich world. But I want to get one step further. It's not enough to develop strong skills. It's also very important for societies to utilize their skills' potential, to make sure that better skills feed into better jobs and ultimately better lives, to extract value from the skills that people have. And last but not least, the tough question of who should pay for what, when, and how. So those are the kind of questions I want to address with you this morning. I also want to touch on some of the challenges, socioeconomic challenges that are confronting our school systems in the 21st century. For example, growing income inequality in most of the countries, at least in the industrialized world. In virtually every country, incomes are more unequally distributed today than they were in the late 80s. And what does it mean for education? It means that the young children that arrive at the doorsteps of schools come from an increasingly heterogeneous environment. Schools need to become better to embrace diversity with differentiated pedagogical practices. We're also seeing that there is a significant rise in single-person households in most countries. And again, what does that mean? It means that schools will increasingly have to assume responsibilities that previously were taken on by families. Another demand placed on many schools today. Or migration. When you look at this chart, you can see actually the rapidly rising numbers of people trying to live in another country, particularly moving towards the developed world. And that trend is not abating, it is actually accelerating. And again, it means that our schools need to become better to engage with more diverse learner needs. Important socioeconomic challenges facing many of our school systems. You think about the kind of transitions that we need to reflect on when we talk about the 21st century. In the past, we considered learning a place, bringing children to school. Today, we need to understand that learning is an activity that extends through everything that individuals do through any stage of their life. In the past, we worried a lot about provision, how many seats in the classroom, how many schools. Today, we need to pay a lot more attention to the learning outcomes that are actually achieved. In the past, we could tell teachers pretty much what we expect them to do. Today, schools are changing so rapidly that we need an informed profession, a profession that actually can adapt to changing needs by themselves. In the past, it was about looking upwards in the bureaucracy. Today, it's about looking outwards to the next teacher, to the next school, building networks of professional practice. The past was about management. Today, we need to think about leadership, particularly instructional leadership. In the past, we had sort of parallel worlds of public and private educational provision. Today, we need to think much more intelligently of how we integrate public with private provision. In the past, governments could tell students and teachers and schools what to do. Today, we need to rely more on wisdom at the front line. As you could see, uniformity is no longer sufficient. We need to embrace diversity. We need to move from a curriculum-centered to a learner-centered approach, from seeing culture or diversity as an obstacle to seeing this as the potential of learning in the 21st century. Let's have a look how we can address some of those kinds of challenges. I want to talk first about the kind of learning environments that we need to think about. If you want to foster 21st century skills, first of all, you need to make learning central. Encourage genuine student engagement and also student responsibility. One of the things we can see here, you see some interesting data from New Zealand, is actually the probability of people being happy actually is not so much related to cognitive skills, but actually quite closely related to social and emotional skills. So student engagement is a very important outcome that we need to strive for today. It's also important because if you want to make lifelong learning a reality for all, it's no longer enough to equip students with a lot of knowledge up front, but you want to have motivated, engaged learners who continue to expand their horizon during their lifetime. It's also about fostering lifelong skills-oriented learning instead of just stacking up qualifications early on in life. It's about being acutely sensitive to individual differences. And I want to show you some data from our PISA comparisons. This is the share of resilient students. Basically, students that come from the poorest neighborhoods and disadvantaged backgrounds and still manage to be at par with the top performing group of students. If you go to Shanghai in China or Hong Kong or Vietnam or Singapore, Korea, Japan, and so on, you can see actually there is a very large share of young people who manage to overcome socioeconomic obstacles. But you can also see when you look at the right side of the chart, marked here in red, that in some countries poverty has really become destiny. Making students more resilient has to do with embracing socioeconomic diversity more creatively. We asked students once an interesting question in the PISA comparison. And that was, what do you believe makes you successful in mathematics? And in some countries, North America, for example, but also some European countries, the majority of students said, well, success is always to do with talent. If I'm not born as a genius, I'm going to study something else. So students believe they cannot really change their fate in school. They're just being sorted according to the abilities they went into school. If you ask that very same question to a student in Asia, particularly to students in Shanghai or in Singapore, you'll have 9 out of 10 students who tell you, if I try really, really hard, I trust my teachers are going to help me, and I'm going to be successful. So those students really own their learning processes, see themselves as actors, and that comes because they work in an education system that has very little tolerance for failure, that expects every student to succeed, and that invests in every student's success. The opposite of this picture is interesting as well. Here I show you sort of some data for France and Shanghai from our PISA comparisons. If you look at the French students, for example, many of them say, well, if I didn't get the answer right, I was just unlucky, or my teacher didn't get me interested in this material, or their course material was too hard, or I just made bad guesses on this test, or my teacher didn't explain things well. So the French students blame almost anyone except themselves for failure. If you look at the students in Shanghai, those students who see the problem outside of themselves is much more limited. And that really gives you a good image of what's behind the education system. This is an interesting chart as well. Here I have ordered student performance by decile of social background. Students marked here by the red dots are children from the 10% of the most disadvantaged socioeconomic context. Students that have marked in dark green are the children from the most wealthiest families. And what you can actually see is that students from very similar backgrounds perform very differently across countries. I've drawn a red line here that actually shows you that the 10% of the most disadvantaged students in Shanghai, and they really come from very poor families, often families who work as migrant workers, who have no proper housing and so on. But those students actually outperform the 10% of the most privileged students in a number of other countries. And that really tells us how well we can do in equipping people, even from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, with a strong set of foundation skills that will help them later in success. Continual assessment with formative feedback, helping students to understand every day where they stand, how they can improve, helping teachers to understand, schools to understand, is very important as well. I want to highlight two dimensions here. The one is the focus on processes, what actually happens in school, and the focus on the results. If you do focus neither on the outcomes nor on the processes, you don't expect to get very much. I think that's pretty clear. If you just move towards focusing on outcomes without taking good care of the kind of processes in the school, you often end up with a lot of external control, uninformed prescription, and a very industrial work organization. If you go to the other extreme, you put a lot of emphasis on the processes without due attention to the outcomes. You have to have a lot of trust and goodwill in the education system. Some countries succeed with this. If you look at Denmark, at Finland to some extent, but it is a very tall order to replicate this. The best bet is actually to combine the focus on process with a focus on outcomes, and that's about integrated quality management and trust in the education system. One country that is doing quite well on this is Singapore. For example, when you look at Singapore, almost all schools implemented a shared notion of what good mathematics performance is. They talk regularly with experts. There's basically 100% of teachers who get a good mentoring system. And you come into a school as a novice, and the experienced teachers are going to help you to become a better teacher. There's a lot of written feedback from students. Students are active contributors to shaping learning environments. There's a lot of external evaluation, internal evaluation, systematic recording of data, and so on. So it's a multidimensional system of quality assurance that is highly consistent. Balancing autonomy and accountability is important too. Here's some interesting data from our PISA comparison. On the vertical axis, you see the performance of countries on the PISA test, and on the horizontal axis, you see the level of discretion that schools have for shaping their own learning environments. You can see that there's a slight tendency for countries where schools have greater autonomy, greater responsibility, for those schools to do better. But there are also lots of exceptions to this pattern. No? Countries are not all on the straight line. There are actually countries, look at Shanghai in China, where the discretion of schools is quite limited, but performance is very good. And look at Thailand or Indonesia, where schools have a lot of freedom, but they're not going to do so very well. So school autonomy is just one part of the equation. You can see this actually quite nicely in the next chart. If you are in an education system that doesn't provide a lot of transparency, for example, it's very difficult for educators and parents to see what the results of schooling are because school data are not public. You can actually see that those schools with more autonomy do worse than schools with less autonomy. It's the orange bars here. But if you are in an education system that is highly transparent, very open, then you can see how school autonomy becomes a predictor for success. It's not about more or less autonomy. It's about autonomy in a context of transparency. If you are in education systems where there is no shared notion of what good mathematics education is, no standardized policy for this, no national curriculum, you can again see that more school autonomy is often associated with poor outcomes. If you do have a shared notion of good policy in mathematics, every school knows what good mathematics is really about, you can see how school autonomy becomes a predictor for success. Last but not least, if school autonomy means the principal decides everything and teachers are not part of that equation, you can see again in the orange bars how school autonomy works against you. However, if you are in a system of distributed leadership, where teachers and school principals jointly shape the learning environment, There you can see where school autonomy becomes a predictor for success. So it's always important to look at those factors not in isolation, but in combination. Being demanding to every student without overloading them. That's one of the most important characteristics of the highest performing education systems. They do expect every student to succeed. They have clear, ambitious goals that are shared across the system, and they're often aligned with high-stakes gateways and instructional systems, usually tough examination systems. There's also a clearly articulated delivery chain through which curricular goals, standards, translate into the instructional system what actually happens in the classroom. We can also do better in the 21st century to foster demand-sensitive and relevant learning, learning that also involves employers. This is very important today. The schools need to become more open towards the evolution of skill demand in our societies. You can actually see how the combination of education and work can be quite conducive to better outcomes. If you are in education between the age of 16 and 25, you can see from this chart that you actually do learn something. Now, the red line actually moves upwards. Students at age 25 demonstrate higher skills on a test than students at earlier ages. But what's interesting is when you look at the green line, these are youths who are in education and work. For example, they participate in some form of apprenticeship. They start out a bit lower because often that's not the preferred choice of highly skilled young people, but they end up pretty much at the same point. Even young people in work, that's the brown line here, continue to grow their skill potential. The only people in trouble are those who are not in education and not in work, who you can see actually end up worse at age 25 than where they started at age 16. And again, these data are from our survey of adult skills. Ensuring that learning is social and collaborative. You've seen in my initial chart that the rise in the demand for social skills is particularly important. How do we foster social skills? Well, by creating learning environments in which collaborative skills are being developed. Last but not least, it is important that we become better at promoting connections across subjects and activities within school, but also beyond school. Today, innovation is no longer about you being very, very good in your own disciplinary specialization. Innovation is about connecting the dots between different fields of study, different areas of work where the next innovation is going to come from. So schools need to become better at helping students to think across disciplinary boundaries. Some countries, think about Japan, have introduced an integrated course of study where exactly those kinds of thinking is fostered. Finland most recently has introduced a topic-based curriculum that tries to strengthen those boundaries across the curriculum. So a lot of development happening here. This is a tall order to get there. It's a tough mountain. And one of the things that we have learned is that the only way to get there is to equip your teachers with the right skills. And no education system can be better than its teachers. So I want to talk a little bit more about teaching that fosters quality and equity now. One factor that shapes the attractiveness of the teaching profession obviously is, to what extent teaching is respected in society. We recently collected some data on this through our TALIS survey, and on the vertical axis you see the percentage of teachers who agree or strongly agree that teaching is a valued profession in society. If you're in Malaysia, if you're in Singapore, Korea, Abu Dhabi, Finland, and so on, you have about 2/3 or more of teachers who see their profession as valued by society. But if you are in France or Sweden or the Slovak Republic, it's just 5 in 100 of teachers who see the job they do every day being valued by society. Now you can say, well, that's just the opinion of teachers. But in fact, if you square those results with the data from PISA that I showed you previously, you can actually see that there's a pretty close relationship between the value teachers see society attributing to their profession and learning outcomes, particularly excellence in learning outcomes. It is not so clear what the causal relationship in this diagram is. No? Maybe it is. If teachers do a great job, society is going to respect them. But it could also be that where society really values teaching, it will be easier to attract the best and brightest into the teaching profession and to create the kind of environment that ultimately leads to better learning outcomes. It is important that teachers are well versed in the subjects they teach so that they can use different methods and, if necessary, change their approaches to optimize learning in different situations. Teachers should also have a rich repertoire of teaching strategies, the ability to combine different approaches and the knowledge of how and when to use certain methods and strategies. One of the things that we've seen from our Thales survey is that most teachers in most countries actually value 21st century pedagogies. 9 out of 10 teachers say that my role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own acquiring. Students should be allowed to think of solutions to practical problems themselves because a teacher shows them how those problems are solved. There's a little bit of variation among countries, but in most countries, those kinds of preferences for 21st century teaching strategies are quite well established. But you know, when you look at what actually happens in the classroom, also according to teachers themselves, you can see the pattern is quite different. For example, you have only about 50% of teachers who frequently use students working in small groups to come up with a joint solution. But again, when you think about the importance of social skills, there is an obvious gap between what teachers value and what they do. Or students work on projects that require at least 1 week to complete. Again, you know, getting students involved in sustained activity. Also, that is something that we just see in about 30% of the cases happening frequently. Some countries a little bit more, in some countries less, but overall you can see there is a gap between the aspiration of teachers for 21st century pedagogies and actually practice in the classroom. How do we bridge that gap? I want to come back to Finland. Finland actually is again an interesting example of a country that has made teaching very attractive in the way they educate their teachers starts with this. They basically bring the practical experience very early on in the development of teachers. Teachers have a lot of exposure to learning in the classroom. I asked a Finnish English teacher to explain that to me, and listen to her.
So the teacher trainees need to have a certain amount of years of their subject learned at the university before they can enter the teacher training program. Teacher training for subject teachers lasts for a year, and so initially they start with theory. They are at the university for some weeks. Then they come to us for a period of orientation where they meet their mentor teachers and they get to see the classrooms. And then there's a period during which they teach in pairs. After that, they go back to the university to get some more theory. They also have now some experience. They're able to maybe ask different questions because they have some experience from the practical side of things. And so it's kind of a wave back and forth between coming to get the practical side at the school and then going back to gain some more information regarding theory.
It is important that teachers have a deep understanding of how learning happens and that they strengthen student initiative and creative skills. I want to show you some interesting data from Japan. If you think about the past of Japan, you could see actually there was a lot of emphasis on rote learning, and even today many Japanese students still struggle with open-ended tasks that require them to creatively integrate knowledge. But actually over the last decade, Japan is the country with the greatest improvement in PISA in this among all high-performing countries, because there's been a lot of emphasis on creative skills in the curriculum development in Japan. Here you see the improvement on two types of tasks. On the left side, I show you the improvement of students in the OECD area on tasks that are basically about reproducing subject matter knowledge. They were tested in multiple choice format. And on the right side, I show you the improvement on students' capacities to solve open-ended tasks where they need to creatively construct knowledge. And you can see in the OECD area, there's been more improvement on the creative skills than on the kind of reproduction of subject matter content. But you look to Japan, and you can see on both dimensions, Japan has increased much faster than most countries in the OECD area. And this is quite encouraging because it does show that we can change the instructional core, what happens in the classroom, in a quite reasonable period of time. It's important that teachers reflect on their practices in order to learn from their experiences. And that's something that I've seen many times in Sweden, where school leaders continually challenge their staff. How do we know that what we're doing is the right thing? Could we test another way of doing it? What do we know about how people in other schools do those kinds of things? Instructional leadership, very, very important. It's also important that teachers work in highly collaborative ways, working with other teachers and professionals within the same school or with other organizations, building networks of professional learning communities. Very, very important. A country that has put a lot of emphasis on this is Ontario, or a province in Canada, basically with their leadership strategy. But also Singapore is a model for how you can actually get teachers involved in actually shaping their own learning environments through professional learning communities.
To do that, really we get teachers to work together, to collaborate, and to look at each other's practice in the classroom. I think that is essential and really very critical, because the good teaching practices should not reside within the four walls and be kept to one teacher, and I think there is a lot of sharing that we can have in this school.
What you want to do right now is, okay, think of the Socratic questions, okay, what do I want to use to further define, clarify? Now, okay, I will go on the internet, I will find any sort of evidence that will help support this statement or refute this.
Professional learning community in schools was started basically to ensure that teachers had a platform to develop their teaching practices. Our main focus actually is to make sure that students learn best. And in order to do that, we have to collaborate. We exchange ideas, we try out, we test, and eventually we check for results. And the intention really is to share ideas to make it better for the students.
Teachers also need to acquire strong technology skills and skills to use technology as effective teaching tools in the 21st century, because that's the world, that's the reality in which students are at work. Currently we have a lot of technology in classrooms, but actually very few examples where this is meaningfully integrated in our instructional system. Australia has done a lot of work in the Learning Federation to provide digital content to schools at the critical mass that schools need. And again, Singapore's future schools are amazing examples of how you can encourage innovation and enterprise in teaching practice, and also how you build flexible learning environments with special emphasis on the use of technology.
So we look at technology very meaningfully, and we see how can we leverage this technology to make a very significant impact in the classroom instruction. I'll give you an example. In a classroom of 40, it is really impossible to get 40 students to ask 40 questions at one go. When we use the instant messaging tool, we open 40 windows to 40 kids. They could ask 40 questions at the same time, and the teacher could see their thinking on the technology tool that they use. And kids get more excited because they are using the tools that they are very, very good in using, not just the pen and the pencil.
Right, everything consolidated on one PowerPoint slide. Use the main thing as a skeleton, then you add on to the different parts. Okay?
A lot of our younger teachers are coming in. They're a lot more savvy in the use of information communication technology tools. And I see them teaching the more senior teachers how to use those tools effectively.
Last but not least, it is important that teachers have the space to design, lead and manage and plan learning environments in collaboration with other teachers and schools. One system that has impressed me very much in this regard is Shanghai. Shanghai, which has been very, very good in attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms and to get the most advanced principals into the toughest schools. If you're a vice principal in Shanghai and one day you tell yourself you want to become a principal, the system tells you, well, that's possible, but first help us turn around one of the lowest performing schools. So basically, it's all about improvement. Your own career depends on the impact that you have not only for your own students but on the education system overall. Teachers in Shanghai are connected through a digital network. They share their lesson plans. And the more other teachers use your lesson plans, comment on them, criticize them, provide feedback for you, the more popular you become in the education system. And at the end of the year, when you are evaluated, you're evaluated on your own personal performance, but also very much on the way in which you've contributed to better educational outcomes throughout the system.
那么如何来改变这种现状呢？我们就想到了，是不是能够把一些好的学校与相对困难的学校结成办学联合体呢？这个建议得到了我们教育行政部门，当然也得到了社区的广泛的认同与支持。于是我们就开展了这项工作。那么这项工作是怎么来做的呢？从政府来说，我们出台了相应的政策，就是鼓励与支持办学相对好的学校与相对困难的学校结成对子。第二呢，我们好的学校与相对困难的学校结成对子呢，我们要签订一个合作办学的协议。这个合作办学协议里面呢，就是明确了各自的责任、权利与义务。
Teaching at the core of the 21st century education system. I talked about technology, but I want to stress here that, great technology can amplify great teaching. But great technology has never successfully replaced poor teaching. The quality of education can never exceed the quality of teachers. And of course, the environment is also very important. And let me touch very briefly on school leadership. This is about supporting, evaluating, and developing teacher quality, the relentless focus on professionalization in the school. It's about strategic resource management, about building leadership beyond school walls, connecting schools. And most importantly, school principals who have vision for results, who are strongly focused on equity, on goal setting, and to use assessment and accountability as tools to see where they stand and how they move forward. What does it all mean? Innovation. Innovation has to do with innovation and research inspired by science. Think about this for a moment. Research in education. If we compare ourselves with health, we find that OECD countries spend 15 times more on health research than on education research, despite the fact that education and health consume similar amounts of public resources. So education is still a quite poor, sort of knowledge-poor kind of subject. It's also to do with innovation and knowledge inspired by practitioners, teachers, school aides, for example. It's innovation inspired by users, students, parents, communities, and of course also innovation inspired through entrepreneurial development of new products and services, particularly when we talk about technology. Let me conclude that. In the past, it was enough if some students learned at very high levels, because our labor markets only needed a very few highly skilled people. Today we need to ensure that all students learn at high levels, and the most successful education systems show us that we can come pretty close to this. In the past, we could focus on routine cognitive skills for lifetime jobs, teaching students something that will last for their life. In the rapidly changing world of today, it's about learning to learn. It's about complex ways of thinking. It's about complex ways of working that need to be at the center of our attention. And that has deep implications on the quality of teachers. In the past, teachers were basically delivering prefabricated government curricula. Today, we need to expect them to be high-level professional knowledge workers. And the trouble is that those professional knowledge workers don't like to work in an industrial, tayloristic, hierarchical work organization. They aspire to flat, collegial, differentiated, and diverse careers. And that also has to do with accountability. In the past, accountability was all about feeding information upwards in the system to the next principal, to the next school, to the next system. Today, it's very much to do with peer and lateral accountability, connecting teachers, connecting schools to build a stronger education system. What our data show is that quality and equity can be achieved jointly. Some of the countries are already moving pretty close to the goals that we need to see for all countries in the 21st century. Thank you very much.